This is Juan Pablo Bouza speaking, and you're watching the time-lapse about rigging Vincent. As you may already know, Vincent is a free character that you can download at the character library of the Blender Cloud. It was originally designed by Matias Mendiola, and it was modeled by Andy Goralczyk, and then it was rigged by me, using BlenRig 5. BlenRig 5 is a free add-on that you can download at the Blender Cloud, or you can also get the latest version at this address of gitlab.com. Once you downloaded the zip file, you can install BlenRig by going to File, User Preferences, Add-ons, Install from File, you select the zip file, and then you can enable the add-on. Recently, the PDF documentation about BlenRig, in which you will find a step-by-step guide about how to rig a character from scratch with BlenRig, was also made available for free on the Blender Cloud. So you can read that PDF file to get a better idea of how the rig works. And if you become even more interested in using BlenRig for your own projects, you can also sign up to the Blender Cloud, and there you will find several hours of training material with many step-by-step guides about how to rig your characters with this rig, among other things. Currently, BlenRig is only intended for film production, but in the near future I plan to do other presets of the rig, like for example a game engine ready rig, a quadruped rig, and even some vehicles rigs. So stay tuned to any news about the BlenRig project. Now let's get our hands on Vincent. First, I'll add the BlenRig armature from the Add Object menu, and then from the BlenRig rigging panel, I will enable the reproportion mode to retarget the rig. In this mode, you will get all the necessary controllers in order to fit the armature to your characters. So first, I'll adjust all the controllers to the body of the character. Just a quick note about the fingers. Remember that BlenRig has the option to have IK in the fingers, so it is a good idea to place the fingers with a little bit of initial inclination so that the IK knows where to bend to. So then I'll go on with the head. There is a face master controller that will let you adjust the whole face at once. Here I'm just mirroring the pose to start getting things in place. BlenRig has a facial rig based on bones, so you don't have to rely on shape keys to do the facial expressions of the characters. And all the mechanic of this facial rig is fully automated, and it will let you achieve any expression you can imagine. So getting the face right on this first stage of the process, it's really important. As you can see, the face is divided in different colors for each facial part, so that you can fit each part separately into your model without any visual hassle. You can see what all these different bone colors are about in the bone groups list of the armature. Also, it is a good idea when adjusting the face that you enable the B-bones option in the armature, so that you can see the actual curvature that the bones have. All the deformation that the rig delivers is based on B-bones, so it is nice to know how the curvature of the bones is behaving in order to make everything look as smooth as possible, and to avoid bone flipping or sharp edges. About the main facial rig, I first adjust the lip controllers, and then I adjust all the outer controllers that surround the cheeks and the chin. This is because all the intermediate controllers will adjust automatically to these two ends, the lips and the outer controllers. So in other words, the rig kind of spreads from the lips to the outer face. Then, of course, after doing this, I'll manually tweak all the intermediate controllers too. So after adjusting all the controllers, I can mirror the pose, and then I can start with the baking process. When you add the BlenRig armature, you're not only adding that armature, but you are also adding some lattices to the scene, the mesh deform cage, which will deliver automatic body deformation without any need of weight painting the character, and a low resolution model for creating low resolution proxies of your character. So, as you can see, those models are already responding to the newly adjusted proportions of the rig, which now fit Vincent. And what I will do is to first bake the meshes, and I will bake the armature last. So I press the bake mesh button in each mesh, and then I go back to the armature and press the bake armature button. Oh, here I realized that I have forgotten to adjust the hat and eyeglasses controllers of the armature, so I adjust those controllers and then bake the armature again. Once the armature is baked, I go into edit mode and I run a couple of operators. First, the fix joints operator, which will fix some minor errors that may occur after the baking with the placement of the bones, and then I run the calc rolls operator, which will automatically calculate the roll angles for all the bones in the armature. Then I can go back into pose mode and I can turn off the reproportion mode. So now that all the objects of the rig are baked into the proportions of Vincent, I can move on to adjusting the mesh deform cage. For doing that, I will go into edit mode and I will start moving the vertices of the mesh deform cage so that this object completely surrounds the character. Needless to say is that if you do not want to use the mesh deform technique, you can weight paint the character manually or you can do automated weights. All of that is valid, but BlenRig comes with a mesh deform cage that is already weighted and that has been constructed with many techniques that will ensure the best possible deformation. For those who don't know what mesh deform is, you can think of mesh deform as a customized lattice, so this low resolution mesh will drive the deformation of the model. But as it is a very simple mesh, you can weight paint it and add shape keys and edit it in a much easier way than directly editing the character. Besides that, mesh deform will deliver an organic deformation that no other method will be able to achieve. So it is a very nice technique to use for organic characters. Once I'm done editing the mesh, I will add a mesh deform modifier to the body and the head of Vincent. And I will first bind these modifiers at level 5. This is because with precision level 5, mesh deform will bind very quickly and I will be able to check if all the vertices of the model are moving along with the rig. So as you can see here, many vertices have been left outside of the calculation. So I will unbind the modifiers and I will edit again the mesh deform cage, making sure that all of those vertices are inside of the cage. I will repeat that procedure until I get everything right. So I bind the modifiers again and check for loose vertices. Okay, now that all the character is moving along with the rig correctly, I will unbind the modifiers for the last time and I will do the final binding in precision level 7. This can take several minutes and up to half an hour sometimes, but it guarantees a correct deformation of the character. So it is very important to do the final binding at level 7. Here I'm checking the out-of-the-box deformation and you can see it's pretty decent. But as this is a main character, I will pay a lot of attention to details when it comes to deformation. In the Blender Cloud tutorials, I talk about ways of how to speed up this process for secondary characters using deformation enhancer modifiers and other techniques. So if you're interested in that, you can check out the training material on the Blender Cloud. Although in the ways that I do things, I usually take the time to tweak all the deformation manually in order to have complete control over the process. So here I am adding subsurf modifiers to the objects, and I'm adding a driver to the viewport subdivision level so that I can control the whole subdivision of the character from the model resolution property that is on the BlenRig panel. After doing that, I'm going to go joint by joint, checking how deformation is doing in each part of the body. Here I'm just tweaking some IK parameters so that the knee can fully extend. And here I found out that the joint of the thigh and the pelvis was kind of too low, so I'm going into reproportion mode again, and I'm hiring that joint, and I bake the rig once more. So basically what I'm doing now is a first deformation pass. So in this first pass, I basically use three factors: the geometry of the mesh deform cage, and that is, if I see that the influence of the mesh deform cage isn't working that great, I may need to unbind the modifier, tweak the geometry of the mesh deform cage, and then bind the modifier again. And this is because, as I said earlier, BlenRig's mesh deform cage is built up with many topology techniques that deliver a better deformation out of the box. So the relation between the model and the edge loops of the mesh deform cage is really important in order to get a good deformation. The other deformation factor that I take into account in this first pass are the deformation helper bones. And these bones, which have the suffix fix, are placed in each joint of the armature, and they move away from the joint when the joint rotates. So these bones greatly improve volume preservation. So as you can see, here I'm also tweaking the weight painting of the deformation bones over the mesh deform cage so that everything looks as best as possible. The other thing I do with the deformation helper bones is to change their behavior by slightly tweaking the values of their transformation constraints. That way I can make them move more or less according to the needs of that joint. And finally, the third thing that I use for correcting deformation in this first pass is to use the parameters called realistic joints. In BlenRig, these parameters let you simulate the actual volume of real-life bones, because in many cases, real-life bones not only rotate, but they move in an oval fashion along the head of the neighboring bone. So, this realistic joint parameter lets you simulate that, and it is another great way to help in volume preservation when the rig articulates. Well, here I'm going to add some edge loops to the mesh deform cage in the area of the belt of the character, so that I can see if I can make the belt deform in a less rubber-like way when the character moves the pelvis. So by adding more edge loops and by modifying a bit the weight painting, I will try to make the belt look more rigid. So well, I'm glad with how the belt deforms now, and I'm going to check the remaining parts of the body. Here I'm going to set up some automated movement parameters that can be found in the rigging panel. And in these parameters you can basically set how the shoulder behaves when the arm moves in IK. So the shoulder kind of follows the arm automatically when it moves. You can also set up the behavior of the foot roll, which you can set to roll from the heels to the tip of the foot. And you can also set how the spine behaves when you rotate the master spine controller. The good thing about mesh deform is that the deformation of the cage doesn't have to be perfect. The cage can have intersections that may not look 100% correct, but the important thing here is that the character itself deforms correctly. So if you think of mesh deform as a kind of lattice, you can understand that the main objective of the deformation of the mesh deform cage is to pull and push the vertices of the main character, as this model won't mimic the deformation of the mesh deform cage, but instead it will be influenced smoothly and organically. So the good news is that we don't have to care about the deformation of the mesh deform cage being perfect, because the important thing here is how the character is deforming under the mesh deform cage, and in most cases that will be smoothly and organically, and it will let you achieve deformations that you would just not be able to achieve with other methods. Once I have done my best tweaking the deformation with the armature, the second deformation pass will be adding corrective shape keys in those places that I was not able to achieve a perfect deformation just with the mesh deform cage and the armature. So I move the character into critical poses, and then I add the shape key to correct the problematic deformation. Remember that in the PDF documentation and in the step-by-step tutorials of the Blender Cloud, I explain which bones you have to use in each body part in order to drive the shape keys. In those tutorials, I also show how to easily set up the drivers. As you can notice, it is very easy to edit the shape keys of the mesh deform cage, and you can see how the deformation is improved in real time over the character's model. So once I'm done with the shape key, I mirror it and I also copy the driver, but then I change the target bone of the driver from left to right. In the area of the elbow, I ended up using 3 different shape keys to drive the motion of the sleeve of the shirt when the forearm rotates. So here I'm editing the curves so that the shape keys overlap with each other a bit, in order to make the motion look right. and then I just mirror the shape keys to the other side. So I go checking joint by joint, now with the torso. Here I will duplicate the mesh deform cage because I want the deformation of the neck of the character to be independent from the deformation of the neck of the shirt. And for that I need another mesh deform cage. So one mesh deform cage will deform the shirt of the character and the other mesh deform cage will deform the head and neck of the character. I will get rid of unnecessary geometry because this mesh deform cage will only influence the head model. So I will assign this new mesh deform cage to the mesh deform modifier of the head, and then I'm going to bind the modifier again. So I will duplicate the bones of the neck of the armature. And then I'm going to erase all the constraints that make these bones rotate with the head. Then I will assign these new bones to the mesh deform cage that deforms the shirt. And in this way, I'm making the shirt independent from the head rotation. So, as this is a separate mesh deform cage, I can also add extra controllers to deform the neck of the shirt. Here I'm just editing the shirt model so that it overlaps with the neck of the character and we don't see a gap between the two models. And of course, with any change that you make to the geometry, you have to rebind the mesh deform modifiers. Here I will add a shape key to correct the intersection between the shirt and the neck in this extreme pose. Here I will just duplicate the buttons of the shirt of the character, and I will parent them with vertex parenting to the mesh of the shirt. This way I prevent the buttons to squash and stretch with the motion of the body, as they do if they are deformed by the mesh deform cage. Here I'm adding some corrective shape keys to the buttons objects so that they don't intersect with the shirt. And after doing some tests, I will just leave 3 vertices from the original buttons in the shirt model, and I will vertex parent the button objects to these 3 vertices. So far we've seen that mesh deform works great for the body, but when it comes to small areas or rigid areas, mesh deform doesn't do that well. So, in those cases, we will use the armature modifier to deform the model, and that is the head, the hands with the fingers, and the feet if the character has toes. In this case, the character doesn't have toes, so we will use the mesh deform for the feet, but not for the hands and the head. So now I'll add an armature modifier to the body model, and as the mesh of this character is based on Victor from Cosmos Laundromat, the geometry already has the vertex groups. So what I'm gonna do is to just check how it deforms out of the box, and I'll make some corrections if it is necessary. Here I'm just tweaking a bit the position of the wrist joint. And here I noticed that the bone of the forearm and of the hand are separating too much because of the realistic joint parameter, so I will lower the wrist value in the realistic joints tab. So here I'm modifying the weight painting of the no-mdef group, which divides the influence of the armature modifier and of the mesh deform modifier. By smoothing out the limits of this group, you kind of blend the influence of both modifiers. Here I'm enabling the bone rolls layer, which will allow me to modify the roll angles of the whole armature, and after tweaking the rolls of the bones of the fingers, I'm going to run the custom aligns operator, which will align all the bones of the armature to the bones of this layer. So by editing these bones, you can easily customize the rolls of the whole armature. So I'm going to check how the hand is deforming, and as I did with the body, I'm going to move the fingers into extreme poses and check the deformation there. Because if the deformation is correct in the extreme pose, it will most likely be correct in the intermediate poses. Again, you see that I'm not only tweaking the weight painting of the main bones of the fingers, but also of the deformation helper bones of each of the joints of the fingers. This way, I maintain the volume of the joint as I need. Here I'm checking that all the weights have been mirrored correctly. And here I added a corrective smooth modifier to the model of the body just to enhance the deformation of certain parts of the model. For isolating the influence of this modifier, I create a new vertex group called corrective smooth, and when I paint that vertex group, you can see the influence of the corrective smooth modifier in that area. The corrective smooth modifier is a kind of deformation enhancer modifier because it tries to preserve the smoothness of the surface while also keeping the details of the original model in rest pose. So, you don't have to make abuse of this modifier, but for doing subtle corrections, it is a great addition to Blender. Here I'm just testing how the corrective smooth modifier works in different areas, but finally I only used it in wrists. And now I will improve a bit the deformation of the thigh when it goes up, so I will tweak the shape keys involved. Well, now we are done with the body, so I will move on to the face.